So, ancient Korea. We have record of people living in Korea as long as 400,000 years ago. We have ancient tool-making artifacts that demonstrate the existence of people at that time. About 8,000 BC, we have evidence of ceramics, of pottery in Korea. And again, as I've said several times, I think, ceramics, pottery shards are one of the most reliable and common evidences of human society that we found around the world. Around 4000 BC, we have Stone Age farming as demonstrated. So we know that the people were settled by that time. They were no longer wandering. We have around 1500 BC, a more complex agricultural society is evident, as well as some indication of a sort of socio-political complexity, meaning there were evidences of chieftains and of religious leaders. We can tell that by tombs, by the remains of house foundations. If there are larger buildings, that clearly some people were richer or more important than others. Around 1000 BC, we have bronze metallurgy happening, and about 300 BC, we have evidence of iron weapons and of various tribes beginning to join together into kingdoms. And so we have a very distinct kind of outline of the progression of human habitation in Korea and ancient history. One of the most important, certainly from the point of view of the Koreans, is a historical event. They date to 2333 BC, not to be too exact or anything, that 2333 BC, the kingdom, the first Korean kingdom of Gojoseon, was founded. Now that date is very important to them. The Koreans believe that a being named Dangun descended from heaven and created the first kingdom in 2333, the kingdom of Gojoseon. We have no archaeological evidence of that, but this is very important to Korean identity. You will hear the Koreans, even during the Korean War, they and I'll get to that in a little bit, they talked about the fact, we've had a settled civilization for over 4,000 years. And it's led to a great deal of a sense of independence and various other aspects of their culture. Around 300 BC, we have evidence of another kingdom, the kingdom of Jin, coming into existence in the southern part of the Korean peninsula. We don't know a lot about that, except that we do have evidence that there were acknowledgments and relationships between both of these kingdoms, Gojoseon and Jin, both with China and with Japan at that period of time. Around 100 BC, the Han Dynasty of China invaded Korea, and they established 4 commanderies, or 4 sort of provinces that they controlled in the northern part of the Korean peninsula. The next sort of development in Korea was the creation of 3 kingdoms, Goguryeo in the north, Silla, and Baekje. This was about, that's the 108 BC, that was the Han came in and created these commanderies, and then it broke up into these 3 kingdoms. They fought for supremacy for quite a long time, including fighting against China. China tried to invade the Goguryeo twice in this period of time and were defeated. But eventually, the Silla Kingdom, which sometimes is listed as the Silla Kingdom, sometimes they had an H in there after the S, but the Silla Kingdom eventually absorbed the Baekje in about 660, and then in 668, they then conquered the northern kingdom of Goguryeo, so that there was one kingdom at that time, by 668, in the Korean peninsula, and that was the kingdom of Silla. The Silla Kingdom developed into a quite sophisticated monarchy. They had one king, but they were still a tribal society primarily. It was a gathering together of different tribes. They had a council of tribal leaders from the various tribes around Korea that was called a Hwebek. The Hwebek was responsible. Later on, they became more than tribal leaders. They became the nobles of Korea. They were responsible for deciding who would be the next king. They selected who the next ruler would be, rather than it be something that was passed on as a family lineage. And they created a strictly hierarchical society where most people were serfs or workers of lower rank, but then they had a very distinct ranking of nobles. And different levels of nobles within their structure wore different colored clothing, so that they, particularly different colored hats, so that they could be distinguished from one another. So it was a very delineated kind of hierarchy. Following the Chinese example, they created a Confucian college or university, a training center, where the children of nobles could attend and learn Confucian principles and then take exams for placement into government positions. They did this in China. There was a short period of time they did a similar thing in Japan. In both cases, Korea and Japan, they learned this or inherited it from the model in China. About the 4th century AD, Buddhism came over to Korea from China, and it was 2 centuries after that that it moved from China over to Japan. But Buddhism was introduced, a lot of temples were built, and so Buddhism became a major influence at that point. In the late 8th century, the Silla Kingdom started to break down. They started to have various peripheral areas of the country. Warlords in those areas would begin to declare their independence. Finally, in 918 AD, one of those particular warlords, Wang Yan, formed a state which he called Goryeo. This is where the name Korea comes from. Goryeo was a kingdom. He declared independence, and eventually he became the overall ruler in 935. So from 918 to 935, as they were setting up this kingdom of Goryeo, we see this as the period of the unitary dynastic, where Goryeo became the dominant force over all of the Korean peninsula. Several times the kingdom of Goryeo was successful in fighting off the Chinese invasions by the Yurkins from Manchuria, which is the China just across the Yalu River. That's the first province of China that you come to from Korea, is Manchuria. Then in the 1200s, the Mongols invaded Korea, and the royal family of Korea had to flee. They actually lived for over 20 years on an island hiding from the Mongols. But despite the fact that they had succeeded in invading the Mongols, because again, the Mongols were always interested in invading, they weren't particularly interested in ruling. And so they kind of rampaged up and down the Korean peninsula for many years, but they never completely controlled the Koreans. The Koreans have always proven to be quite feisty when people have tried to take them over, and we'll talk about a couple of examples of that. In the 13th century, Neo-Confucianism, a new version of Confucianism, which was even more conservative, more fundamentalist, came over from China, and it became the primary religion or religious attitude. Confucianism is much more of a philosophy than a religion. It doesn't have anything in it about God, but it is very much a way of life. And so Neo-Confucianism came in the 13th century and began to really dominate the Korean ideas. Then in 1292, the beginning of the Joseon period, there was a general named Yi Seong-gai. Yi Seong-gai was ordered by the king of Korea and his bosses to invade Ming China. Well, the general did not think that was a good idea, so instead he turned around and attacked the rulers of Korea, and he ended up winning, and he became the king of Korea. And it was in 1394, 2 years after he took over and the Joseon period began, that he moved the capital to Seoul, the place where the capital of Korea has always remained since that time, although there have been other. Pyongyang in the north obviously is the capital of North Korea today, and it's been used as well. In the late 14th century, they officially made Confucianism the state religion, and Buddhism lost most of its influence in Korea. In 1443, a really unusual thing happened, and that is they introduced a Korean alphabet. It is almost the only writing system in the world that we know exactly who created it and exactly when they created it and introduced it. 1443, the Korean alphabet was introduced. Unlike the ideograms of Chinese, Korean is actually an alphabetic system, so that there are phonetic letters that build the words. Well, that began in 1443, and they're very proud of that fact, that they can trace their unique Korean language to a particular date and a particular founder. In 1592, and that's what we have represented here, the Japanese invaded Korea in the 1590s twice. This was called the Imjin War. They were successful on land, but they were defeated by a Korean admiral at that time, who was a sea admiral named Yi Sun-sin. He defeated them, drove them off. When they got back to Japan, the shogun of that period died on the way back to the capital city, and that was the start of the Tokugawa shogunate, the last major shogunate. And it was partly because of their difficulty with Korea, and partly because of the difficulty with other Westerners coming in and telling them different things, conflicts between Catholicism and Protestantism in the 1500s. The Dutch came in and were really railing against the Catholics that had been there before. It was because of that, some of that, including the Imjin War, that the shogun decided to enter the period of Sakuro, which is isolation in Japan. But during this time, when they came back from the Imjin War, that is when the Japanese came back from their attempt to try to conquer Korea, they brought with them several thousand ceramicists, that is potters, people who really understood how to do beautiful pottery. And even today, the Japanese, in their clearer moments, will admit the very finest of Japanese pottery, including their use of the very finest porcelain, was really developed by the Koreans. And it was Koreans that were brought, after the Imjin War in the late 1500s, brought over to Japan that really developed a lot of that technology. In the 18th century, Koreans in China met up with the first of the Christian Jesuit missionaries that they met, and they brought Catholic Christianity back to Korea from China in the 18th century. And today, an estimated 30% of all South Koreans, I'm not speaking to North Korea now, but 30% of all South Koreans are Christian. That's much more than you will find in Japan, for instance, which is less than 2% Christian. China, we don't really know. There are some people who believe because of the underground church in China and the huge population, there may be more Christians in China than in the whole rest of the world. But because of the fact that the church, while the church is allowed, there are 5 denomination or religious groups that are allowed in China, the majority of practicing Christians still do so under the radar, and so we're not really sure how many there were. Then in the 19th century, we have Europeans beginning to arrive in Korea, and the reason that I love this picture, you can see that we have Westerners here and down here, but the main reason that I use this picture is because I think those hats are really cool. I would love to have one of those hats. Distinctly Korean, and but the Westerners started coming in, but many of the Koreans did not really understand or were unwilling to trade with or accept the Westerners when they came in. And there was a period of time in the 19th century, earlier 19th century, when the Koreans tried to be isolationist as well. But during that same time, China started having more and more influence over them. And then in 1876, because this is the period, the Meiji Restoration, which was in the 1860s, because Japan was trying to expand and become a major manufacturing country and develop a modern military, but they didn't have the resources, they started getting involved in Korea as a trade partner. In 1876, the Japanese pretty much forced Korea to open themselves, to end the isolation they had from other countries besides China, and forced them to open themselves to trade with Japan. And Japan, from that point, from the late 1870s, they began to have more and more influence over Korea. The influence of China diminished, the influence of Japan over Korea increased, and a lot of conflict occurred during this time between China and Japan over Korea. In the 1880s, the king of Korea decided that he was going to do the same thing that the Japanese were doing. He was going to pursue a period of advancement, a period of modernizing. And he actually developed a slogan, this is in 1880, that they were going to use Eastern ethics but Western technology. Unfortunately, nobody really liked that idea except him, and so he had a real hard time selling it. But during this period of time, again in the 1880s, after the decision of King Gojong to try to modernize and to open themselves up to Western technology, they signed trade agreements with the USA, with Britain, Germany, Russia, and France. but still Japan is taking more and more control. In the 1880s, by that time, the Koreans had split in two parties. One of them was pro-Chinese. They wanted to keep the kind of relationship they'd had with China and reject Japan. The other side wanted to accept Japan as the new influence, primary influence in their country, and reject China. And there was conflict. Actually, in 1882, what was called the Imo Rebellion, a group of pro-Chinese, anti-Japanese Koreans actually burned the Japanese legation building, killed a military advisor of Japan, and the other representatives of the Japanese legation had to escape the country in a fishing boat. I showed you some images of that when we talked about Japan. So this led to a reparations being paid by Korea to Japan, not crippling reparations, but still, it actually ended up solidifying Japanese influence once they had gotten past that. So various conflicts continued between China and Japan over Korea. Eventually they signed a treaty. There was always these flare-ups and these threats of war. Finally they signed a treaty called the Lee-Ito Treaty, where both China and Japan agreed to remove their troops and not send any back in without the other side's permission. Well, in 1894, there was a rebellion in Korea called the Donggak Rebellion. And the Korean king, who had been accustomed to China being the primary person, Japan had not really offset that completely yet, he asked China to help him put down this major rebellion, the Donggak Rebellion. So China sent troops in, and they didn't ask Japan before they did it. So Japan considered this a major violation of a treaty, so they sent their troops in, and that year, 1894, was the first Sino-Japanese War, the war between China and Japan. And much to everyone's surprise, the Japanese ended up winning that war in a period of only about 6 months. Everyone thought that the giant army of China would win, but China had not been successful in modernizing in the same way that Japan had. And so from that point on, from 1895 actually on, the Japanese began to take control of Korea. Initially, they sent in a regent and a council to help govern Korea, to sort of bring them along in terms of advancing them. And at first they began to institute policies, the Japanese began to institute policy in Korea that sounded like good ideas to everybody. They abolished slavery, they abolished the child bride system, children could not be married off. They made it possible for widows to remarry, which had never been allowed in Korea before that time. And so a number of the things they were doing sounded like really good plans. But eventually the Japanese, as they took more and more control of Korea, at first they just, the Korea was still independent, but the Japanese were simply influencing them because they'd stepped in where China had previously been involved. But eventually, over the next, actually 45 years, the Japanese became more and more involved in Korea. They took more and more liberties in terms of trying to control the future and even the culture of Korea. They closed all the Korean newspapers. They eventually made the study of Korean history and Korean culture outlawed, and they insisted that in the schools they teach Japanese culture. They abolished Confucian thought in favor of, later on, once they became Korea became an official colony, when they were annexed in 1910, they eventually made the religion of Shinto required for Koreans. Now, Shinto is the folk religion of Japan. It had had no presence in Korea prior to that. Land, eventually the Japanese were taking land away from Korean farmers and giving it to Japanese farmers if they would move to Korea in order to encourage this immigration. Japanese businesses were set up in Korea, and then any businesses of Korean businessmen that competed with those were shut down so that there wouldn't be any competition. The Korean army was disbanded, and then finally in 1910, the Japanese just decided to get rid of any pretense, and they actually annexed all of Korea and officially made it part of Japan. This was the start of what's called the colonial period, which lasted from 1910 to 1945. And again, Korea began to be treated by the Japanese as a defeated power, as nothing more really than a source of things that Japan needed. Much of the food that Korea grew was being exported to Japan, or later on, after the start of the Second Sino-Chinese War, they were shipping a lot of food off to the Japanese army in China and other places. They were actually forcibly taking Korean men and making them serve as frontline troops in the Japanese army. They also took several thousand Korean women and turned them into comfort women for the Japanese army, which basically meant they were forced into prostitution for the Japanese army. So it was a very difficult time. In 1919, this is 9 years after they were annexed, there were peaceful demonstrations throughout Korea about how they were being treated, because it got worse and worse and worse, how they were being treated by Japan. Japan responded by arresting and executing thousands of peaceful protesters. They would countenance no kind of opposition, even peaceful opposition. So Korea is being treated as a conquered people, and as they got more into the 1930s, the militarism, the imperialistic desires of Japan to control more and more resources in East Asia, it got even worse for Korea. The actual calorie consumption and rice consumption in Korea dropped by more than a third during this period of time, because they simply didn't have the food available. The Japanese were taking it to Japan or to their armies elsewhere. In 1945, the Japanese outlawed the Korean language. They outlawed all uniquely Korean cultural and religious practices, and began to force Koreans to take Japanese names and to attend Shinto worship. Sociologists today say that had it not been for the defeat of Japan in 1945, it is very possible that all of Japanese culture and the Japanese language might have been destroyed. That Korean language and Korean culture might have been destroyed by the Japanese. So we then, and these are all images of some of what was happening in Korea under Imperial Japan. I'll get to that one in a minute. I want to talk a little bit more about it. While Japan had defeated Russia in the Sino-Russian War, the Russo-Japanese War in 1904 and 1905, there continued to be flare-ups between Japan and Russia, particularly after the Japanese had defeated Russia. They had taken over much of the area of Manchuria that the Russians had been in, which meant they were just separated by the border, because the Japanese were in China, in Manchuria, and right across the border was Russia. So they had various flare-ups, and as they got along into the 30s, this became a problem for both of them, having to worry about, for the Japanese to worry about the Russians to worry about the Japanese, because Russia, as we got into the period of the Second World War, they were much more concerned about the European theater of war. And especially after Hitler betrayed the agreement he had with Joseph Stalin and invaded Russia in Operation Barbarossa, then obviously Stalin was more concerned about the enemy on his western flank than he was about what might happen in his east and southern areas. So the Japanese also didn't want to have to worry about the Russians, because they were more concerned about the Pacific War that they were planning to start, and also to control areas in East Asia and Southeast Asia. So they signed a non-aggression treaty in 1941. Japan and the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression treaty that said they would not fight against each other, which gave Stalin what he needed to be able to focus on the European war, and the Japanese to be able to focus on the Pacific War, which is what their primary concern was. But after the German invasion of the Soviet Union, and then finally the stemming of the German invasion, particularly at Stalingrad, when the Soviet success at Stalingrad, when they turned the tables and began to push the Germans back further to the west again, at that point Stalin began to also look east, because he felt like, okay, we're on the winning side, we're doing well here against the Germans. He started actually positioning materiel and troops in the southeastern part of the Soviet Union in preparation for being able to take over land there, because the stated goal of Stalinist communism was to control as much of the planet, eventually to have all of the planet under the Soviet banner. And so he began to plan at that point to turn against the Japanese and eventually be able to commit himself to war in that direction. In fact, it was in Stalin's best interest to try to extend the Pacific War once it got started, because the longer that went on, the more he could, if he could get the Americans and the Japanese and the other allies fighting the Pacific War for longer until they ended the European theater, then that meant he could then turn all of his attention on the South and East, rather than have to fight a two-front war. He did not want to have to fight the Germans on one side at the same time he entered into a fight with the Japanese. Because of that, he wanted the Japanese and the Americans and other allies to continue fighting. So he was providing intelligence to the Japanese in order to let them hold out longer against the Allied forces, because he wanted that battle to continue until everything was finished in Germany. Well, at both the 1943 Tehran Conference and in 1945 Yalta Conference, Stalin promised the Allies, Churchill and FDR, and then Truman, that within 1 month of the Germans being defeated, he promised to declare war against Japan and to join in the Pacific battle against the Japanese. But he didn't tell the Japanese that. He was still providing them intelligence to try to extend that war until they really cleaned things up in Europe. Well, in May of 1945, the Germans surrendered. On August 8th, well, in April prior to that, the Russians notified the Japanese that they would not renew their neutrality agreement with them. Then on August 8th, this is 2 days after the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima, 1 day before the dropping of the Nagasaki bomb, the Russians declared war against Japan, and they invaded. Now, this was a huge blow to the Japanese because they had had a neutrality agreement. They had hoped the Russians would come in because they were the allies of the Americans and the British and the others. The Japanese had hoped that the Russians would help them get a better peace agreement, a conditional peace agreement. And they had continued to ask Moscow and to ask Stalin, will you help us with this? And they couldn't get a response and couldn't get a response. And then on August 8th, the declaration of war from Russia, or from the Soviet Union, against Japan came through, and they invaded on that day, August 8th. It only took 2 days for Soviet troops to get down to the northern border of Korea. And when they invaded, the Russians, Stalin didn't fool around when he invaded. All of these are military formations that were used in the invasion of Manchuria as a way to get down here. That Manchuria was an area the Japanese controlled as well. So they came in fighting against the Japanese army, and then of course down here you have Korea, and they also entered into Korea. This is called the Second Russo-Japanese, or more exactly the Soviet-Japanese War. It didn't last very long. From the 8th of August, the 10th of August, they had swept through Manchuria and into the northern part of Korea. Now the Russians and the Americans, when I say Russian, they're Soviet, it's the Soviet Union at this point, but they're ethnic Russians primarily, so that word is used interchangeably. The Soviets and the Americans, as part of their peace, their planning at Yalta and Tehran, they had agreed, and Churchill had agreed, that Russia and the United States would share responsibility for helping Korea recover from the Japanese occupation. That they would take over sort of a sponsorship, or that they would they would come in and settle all of any military residual, if there were still Japanese there, they would take care of that, and then they would help the countries get back on their feet. The expectation and the promise was that they would work together to give them complete independence and set up their own system. And Stalin had agreed that he would allow for a democratic system to be installed in Korea. Well, when the Soviet armies by August 10th were down into the northern part of Korea, there were no U.S. troops there at all. Now, the U.S. and the Soviet Union had agreed they were going to share responsibility for Korea. Well, what happened is, all of a sudden, the U.S. Army had to decide, whoa, Stalin could take over the whole of the Korean Peninsula before we even get there. So they communicated with Stalin, and they came up with a plan that they divide the country along the 38th parallel. And Stalin, much to everybody's surprise, agreed. He brought his troops down, or sent his troops down, to the 38th parallel, and then stopped, which gave the Americans time, early the next month, early in September, to land troops in southern part of Korea, and to bring their troops up to that same line. And so at that point, this is the 38th parallel, the Soviet Union was to be responsible for the northern part of the country, the US was to be responsible for the southern part of the country. The idea and the plan all along was that these two countries, the Soviet Union and the United States, would work together to bring freedom and freely elected officials for Korea. However, that had not been Stalin's plan. Remember, he had a desire to take over to bring communism to as many different places as he could. So initially, when the US troops are in southern part of Korea, they start trying to set up arrangements with the Russians to negotiate a final settlement. Well, in the north, the Russians really did clamp down on the northern Koreans. They decided who was going to be in charge. And they tried several different people who were well known and supported in North Korea. But when those people indicated that they were not willing to do everything that the Soviets wanted them to, the next morning they'd go out to their car to go to work and nobody'd ever see them again. Finally, the Russians determined that they could put a man named Kim Il-sung, who had been a captain in the Soviet army, only a captain, he was like the fifth choice, that they would put him in charge of running North Korea, and he would do everything that they wanted him to do. Well, in the South, the Americans kept trying to say, we need to negotiate this, and the Russians would not agree to move forward because they said, you guys don't have control of the South. Whereas in the North, the Russians would not allow any protests. They would not allow any problems. In the South, when the US comes in and said, okay, we're in charge now for a little while to sort of take care of you, the South Koreans, or the Koreans in the southern part of the country, said, we don't need you here. You know, we just got rid of the Japanese, and now you're coming in saying you're in charge? We have been our own country for 4,000 years, since 2333 BC. And so, get out. And the Americans were not prepared to leave because the danger would be that the Soviets would just take over the rest of the peninsula. But there were major rebellions. On one of the islands of Korea, Jeju, they had sufficient rebellions that the South Korean military forces and the police services came in and crushed the Jeju rebellion. 10,000 people were killed. I mean, there were huge problems in South Korea, and the United States would not do what Russia did in the North. They wouldn't just by force of arms, try. They kept trying to say, we're trying to help you. We're trying to give you a democratic system here. But the Koreans were fed up with having somebody else tell them what to do. Well, the Russians kept saying, you guys don't even have control down there. We're not going to agree to unify the country. But it really was because Stalin wanted to be able to control things. Finally, the United States in 1948 said to the UN, would you please solve this problem, UN? And the UN set a date for elections. The Russians refused. In the South, they had elections, and they democratically elected a government, and the government, after they elected the sort of parliamentary group, they chose Syngman Rhee, a well-known scholar, as being the new president of South Korea. At the same time, in the North, the Russians said, we don't accept that. And so that's the point at which they officially made Kim Il-sung, the former captain of the Soviet army, as the president of the North. And in 1948, all the Soviet troops left. In 1949, all the US troops left. And it left it divided roughly along the 38th parallel. So that this is what we ended up with. Now, there had not yet been a war there. This was just what the Russians in the North and the US in the South left behind. During all of this period of time, it's important to understand that both China was involved in a civil war between the Nationalist and the Communist Party, which is very much what the kind of conflict that we were looking at potentially in Korea. Well, China owed a lot to Stalin. You know, there was a Stalinist system in China. Mao Zedong owed a lot to Stalin. North Korea owed everything to Stalin. And so both of them began looking to Stalin for permission to do things. In 1949, Kim Il-sung, the new head of the Northern Korea, asked Stalin for permission to invade South Korea in order to try to unify the whole country under a communist rule, with him as the leader. Stalin said, no, you can't do it yet, for 3 reasons. One, in 1949, the Americans hadn't all left yet. Secondly, early in 1949, the Americans had a nuclear weapon, and Russia did not test their nuclear weapon until later in 1949. And third, early in 1949, the Chinese communists had not yet won their victory. They declared victory in October of 1949. So those 3 factors, Stalin told Kim Il-sung, it's too early, you can't do that. Well, in 1950, all of the Americans were out of Korea. Chinese communism had won next door in China, and the Soviets had successfully tested a nuclear weapon, which meant they now had that leverage. And at that point, Stalin told Kim Il-sung that he had permission to invade the South. He did say, however, and in fact, the Russians planned the invasion for the North into South Korea. But Stalin said, but if you get in trouble, we are not going to come in with an army and fight you, because Stalin did not want to face the possibility of a war at that time with America. But he said, if you get in trouble, you're going to have to ask Mao from China to come in and help you. And Mao felt the responsibility to do that because he owed a lot to Stalin, as did North Korea. And in fact, the Chinese had been helped by the Northern Koreans in the last few years of their war. They helped provide supplies and soldiers and all sorts of things. Well, in April of 1950, when Stalin gave permission to Kim Il-sung to invade the South, they did so on, they made the plans for it, and then in June of 1950, I won't do that yet, there was a massive invasion of the southern part of Korea by the North, by the Northern armies. At this point, it was just the North Korean army. The American advisors of the South Korean army had been completely unrealistic about how well they had prepared the South Korean army. A general that was responsible for training the South Korean military had said, well, if they ever do invade, it'll just be good target practice for the South Korean army. Well, clashes that had happened across the border made it pretty clear to most of the people that North Korea was on a better footing for war than South Korea was. Well, then, in June of 1950, a massive invasion across the border occurred. It was June 25th. North Korea, with Stalin's permission, launched a full-scale assault across the entirety of the 38th parallel. And in fact, it proved that the South Koreans were not ready to do battle. The Americans were gone other than a few military advisors. And in very short order, the North Koreans pushed the South Korean military down into the southeastern corner, just this little bit of Korea. They pushed them all the way down to the southeastern corner of the country, around Busan, which today is called Busan. At this point, the United Nations saw this as an unwarranted act of aggression, and so the United Nations called for assistance from all of the member nations to try to repel this communist invasion of South Korea. 16 different nations responded with either materiel or troops, but the primary force was from the U.S. President Truman had declared his intention to contain communism, to not allow it to spread. This was a blatant expansion of communist by military force, and so he committed the U.S. troops to this. 88% of all of the UN troops that fought in South Korea were Americans. So the vast majority of the force was American. And the interesting part of this, and the reason it's been called the Korean conflict, it's called the Korean War here, or the police action, is because it's the first time the United States president did not get permission from the U.S. Congress to commit soldiers in a significant way to a military action, to a war. And so technically, from the U.S. point of view, it never was a war. The UN officially called it a police action, to try to respond as a police force to try to stop the North Koreans from invading. Well, what happened is, in fairly short order after they got pushed down there, the Americans committed more troops, and Douglas MacArthur, the general who was in Japan, close by, he was the senior commander of Allied powers in Japan, controlling Japan as part of the occupation force there. Well, he came across, and they did something that everybody thought was a really bad idea. On September 15th, everybody but him, but it turned out to be right. On September 5th, and again, all this happened in June, July, August. On September 5th, they had a major landing under Douglas MacArthur at Incheon, which is the port closest to Seoul. And when this assault was successful in splitting the North Korean forces in two, 125,000 of the North Koreans were captured in this effort, and the others were pushed back north. So that's where you get here. After they landed in Incheon, they started pushing back north. And in fact, they pushed them all the way back to the Yalu River, which was the border between North Korea and China. So, complete reversal. Now the North Koreans have been pushed all the way back to the edge of their land. And in November, Douglas MacArthur said, "This war is won, our troops will be home by Christmas." Well, didn't quite work out that way. You know, MacArthur had sort of had a tendency to speak too soon. Well, he, after they were up at the Yalu River, he actually flew over the front lines to determine whether or not there was any evidence of forces regrouping or of a counteroffensive or anything else, and he announced, "No, there's no sign of that, we're fine, we don't, just stay where you are, everything's good." The next day, 180,000 Chinese soldiers joined the North Korean army and invaded across the Yalu River. And so that's where you get this. November to January of 1951, right after Douglas MacArthur had said there's no problem up here and our troops will be home by Christmas, they invaded and pushed the Americans and South Korean military back down past the 38th parallel again, down to this area of South Korea. At that point, the United UN forces, especially the Americans and South Koreans, put together a counteroffensive, and they succeeded in pushing back the blue arrows back up to the 38th parallel. So it was back and forth and back and forth. The city of Seoul changed hands 4 times during this period of conflict. And it was like there were no small victories in this. It was sweeping. And then once they actually got to this point, in July of, in 1951, and it remained that until for the next 2 years. So most of the actual combat, they had various battles and various efforts along the way, but it pretty much was at a stalemate right back where they had started. Then the person that was in charge of the UN forces there, he had been senior commander of all the Allied forces in the Pacific, was Douglas MacArthur. You see him in various roles here. MacArthur is one of only 5 men in America that ever became a 5-star general. That is, generals of the Army. A 1-star general is a brigadier general, 2-star major general, then lieutenant general, and then 5 stars is general of the Army. He's the 5th one. They don't do that all the time. It basically means he's over everybody that's on the Army side. So MacArthur was only one of 5 generals of the Army ever. He had been a soldier since World War I. His father had been a decorated soldier. He's one of only 2 instances where a father and a son both received the Medal of Honor. MacArthur had received the Medal of Honor. He received 2 Distinguished Service Crosses, 7 Silver Stars, and a Distinguished Flying Cross with Wings. He's one of the most decorated soldiers in the history of the United States military. And again, commander of all the U.S. forces in the Far East from 1941 up until this period in Korea. He had been the one that accepted the Japanese surrender on the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay, was senior commander of all Allied powers in Japan, and then became commander of all UN forces in Korea. Now, again, he was the man as far as the U.S. military in this part of the world, but when he had flown over the Yalu River and declared that there was no danger, there was no sign of any offensive, and then the next day 180,000 Chinese crossed the border and pushed them all the way back to almost the middle of South Korea. That hurt his prestige some, and I think much of it was he wanted to regain that prestige. And so MacArthur disagreed publicly with President Truman, who was his boss, the commander-in-chief of the military. MacArthur at this point was concerned that if the Soviet Union, if we escalated the war beyond where it already was, the Soviet Union might come into it. China would commit themselves in a much greater way than they had already. 180,000 troops was nowhere near a significant part of their military. And that we could have the Third World War within just 5 or 6 years of the last one. And so Truman had said, we will not escalate this war. MacArthur wanted to drop nuclear weapons on the Chinese in North Korea, and also on China. He wanted to get China in the war. And even though Truman said we're not going to do that, MacArthur was very vocal about the fact that he didn't think Truman knew what he was doing. And he felt like he could say whatever he wanted. He had a lot of fans in the U.S. Congress. He was very influential. But the final straw, sort of, this is a meeting that Truman and MacArthur had on Wake Island. MacArthur told him, I want you to come back to Washington, D.C., and MacArthur said, Truman said, I want you to come back to Washington, D.C., and MacArthur said no. He said, I'll come as far as Wake Island. We can meet on Wake Island. But he obviously figured he could call the shots, that he was the equal to the president. Well, Truman was not somebody to be pushed around on stuff like that. So the last straw was when evidence came forth that MacArthur was sending confidential messages to various embassies of U.S. allies, particularly Portugal and Spain was the last straw, where he was promising them that he would bring China full scale into the war, and that he would see to it that nuclear weapons were used in order to destroy communist China. That was the last straw. And Truman, with the complete support of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the military, fired him on April 10th of 1951. That was a really gutsy thing for Truman to do. In fact, that's probably why Truman didn't run for re-election, is because it caused so much bad faith. MacArthur was seen as a hero in the U.S. He had, as I say, a lot of supporters in the Congress, and so Truman decided not to run for office in the next term. So here they are, it's 1951. They're stuck at the 38th parallel again, and the USSR, of all people, proposed that they have peace talks. And so in June of 1951, they began peace talks, which turned out being over the next 2 years on again, off again. And the primary reason they were on again, off again is because many of the North Korean soldiers that had been captured when they landed at Incheon, I told you 125,000 of the North Koreans were taken prisoner. Many of them did not want to go back to North Korea. They wanted to stay in the South because things were not so good where they'd been. They were under a terrible regime. Well, North Korea insisted that all of their captured soldiers be sent home. And the South said they don't want to come home. Well, every time they got to this point in the conversations, the peace treaties broke off, because the North insisted they get all of their soldiers back, and the South said, we're not going to send them back if they don't want to go. And so it was on again, off again. First they met at Kaesong and then at Panmunjom. In November of 1952, Dwight Eisenhower was elected president, obviously known as a great warrior, the leader of the effort D-Day and the effort in Europe. And when he became president, he had promised in his election, in his running for election, that he would solve the Korean problem. He would end the Korean War. When he got elected in November of '52, he went to Korea. He wasn't even president yet, but he was president-elect. And he hinted pretty plainly that the United States were open to a nuclear option if they could not find some other way to find peace in this. Whereas that was absolutely what Truman did not want. Eisenhower hinted pretty plainly at the fact that he would consider that. Well, in July of 1953, they finally came to an armistice agreement. An armistice is not a peace treaty. An armistice is a ceasefire. They agreed to cease aggressive action against one another. So 27th of July of 1953, the active aggressive part of the war ended. Now, there have continued ever since then to be various outbursts of violence between the North and the South at the Demilitarized Zone, which I'll show you in a second. They've had several instances where troops would come across and attack and kill military from the other side and then retreat again. Overall, during the 3 years of the Korean conflict, 54,000 Americans were killed, 3 million Koreans were killed, and 1 million Chinese after their invasion. But one of the things that happened is North Korea, when they were down in South Korea before they were pushed back again, they took thousands, tens of thousands of South Korean men back to the North with them to be, in effect, slave labor. They particularly were concerned about people with technical skills. In the North, after the war ended, the Kim Il-sung's regime they identified, arrested, and executed in excess of 100,000 people. Almost anybody that they thought was well-educated enough or capable enough, had been involved in politics or religious leadership or anything else, they executed them as potential challenges to their authority. So, sort of gives you an idea why the soldiers from North Korea didn't want to go back after they got captured by the South. But this is what they were facing. The conclusion of the war was the development of the DMZ, the Demilitarized Zone, which is, the 38th parallel is this. So this is approximately along the 38th parallel. It is an area of chain link and barbed wire fence, of raked sand, of minefields, of kill zones, interlocking machine guns, mortar and artillery. At one point they said that Seoul, Korea had more large guns and missiles and rockets aimed at it than any other place on the planet had ever had, because the North is prepared, because Seoul isn't that far from the demilitarized zone. And so the idea of being able to launch weapons against the capital city of Seoul is something the North always maintained as a possibility. There are various watchtowers all along. In fact, Carol and I were at the Demilitarized Zone 6 weeks ago or something, and as you drive up there, you're following a river much of the way, and through most of that, they have barriers, barbed wire and towers and spotlights along the river. Because something they discovered is that people will float themselves down the river to try to get out of North Korea to South Korea. Some of them are legitimate refugees. Many of them have turned out to be North Korean agents who want to present themselves as refugees so that they can get to the South and become, spies for the North, or even to do guerrilla activities. In fact, when somebody comes down as a refugee now, they'll take them in, but they keep a very close eye on them for like a year to make sure there is nothing, that they are not associated with the North at all. But this demilitarized zone is about 160 miles long. It's 2.5 miles average wide. And they have the area, this is the joint strategic area, which is where you saw Kim Jong-un from North Korea and President Moon from South Korea meet and shake hands, and it was the first time that they actually had stepped over the line onto one another's, onto the other side's property. This is where they meet, and that is in the DMZ. These references to tunnel, first, second, third, fourth tunnels, they have found 4 tunnels that the North Koreans have tried to dig underneath the DMZ in order to have access for troops if they do decide to invade again. We were able to visit tunnel number 3. You can actually go down in it. They've even put a little train that takes you down, because it's 73 meters below the surface of the earth. 73 meters down, because they were using explosives to cut through solid rock to get there. And then because there was a fellow that came from North Korea and said, they're digging a tunnel here and they're using that big tree as sort of their line of sight, and so start looking, and they found it. They have found 4 of these tunnels. They believe there are probably 20 more that they have not found, that the North has been digging underneath the demilitarized zone. And the one that we visited, which didn't seem very big, but they said the estimate was they could, if they really pushed it, they could get 30,000 troops through there an hour by just simply, they couldn't get big guns or anything, but just running through that tunnel, they could have gotten a lot of people in there. This is the flagpole. This is the flagpole in South Korea, across from the DMZ. The North Korean flagpole is the 4th largest flagpole in the world. It's near Kaijondong, near Panmunjom. It's 160 meters tall. They want to make sure we know they're still there. The South Koreans you've probably heard not too long ago, after the first discussions of peace, they stopped broadcasting. When we were there, they had these enormous speakers. They were broadcasting music and things across the border, and also news reports. North Korea does not have any means for giving weather reports or even determining what the weather's going to do. And so they would give weather reports. And somebody asked one time, well, how do you know that they're even listening to this? How do you know anybody's affected by this? And they said, very simple. The people who live just on the other side in North Korea, when we tell them it's going to rain, they take their laundry in. So we know they're paying attention. But they're actually, the DMZ is not just a no man's zone. There are factories in there that until fairly recently were being operated, jointly operated. There is a village that is in the DMZ. Now the security controls are very, very tight, but it's a very weird kind of setting in the DMZ. Since that time, South Korea, of course, has become an extraordinary, now at first they had their problems. In 1945, when the US pulled out, from that point until the Korean War, the early administration, Syngman Rhee, who came in 1948, he did not prove to be nearly as democratically oriented as they had hoped. In 1949, he used security laws to close the newspapers in South Korea and to imprison his critics. And things got worse in the country, and there was a lot of corruption in South Korea up until 1960. 1960, they had student riots that forced Syngman Rhee to step down. And the next year, there was a military coup. General Park Chung-hee took over as a military commander in charge of the government. He then allowed elections later, and he was elected as president in 1963, in 1967, and in 1971. They had elections every 4 years. They modeled this on the US system. But each time he won by less and less. So finally, after he was elected in 71, he had a new constitution drawn up that gave him far more power. You know, it was almost as though he had the potential to become president for life, like just happened in China. And he was assassinated because of that in October of 79. Another general took over. He had to step down because of protests. The Koreans have never been reluctant to protest, even to the point of violent reaction against them when they felt something was wrong. And then you probably have heard that President Park Geun-hye, who is the first female president, prior to the one we have now, President Moon, she was in office, and she was accused of improprieties in office and of security failings and of various other kinds of things. She was arrested, tried, found guilty. She's now in prison. They have the new president, Moon, who's here. But for all of that, the various kinds of political problems that even South Korea's had, which seemed for much of the last 20 years or so has been stable, with the single exception of their female president having a problem. The economic development of South Korea has been extraordinary. They have developed advanced schools and road systems and bridge systems and public works. They have developed one of the most thriving economies in the world. And they went from being at the Korean War even, a quite poor, developing or underdeveloped nation, to being a major economic power in the world. On the other hand, the North Koreans, Kim Il-sung, who the Soviets had put in place, this is him. He really pushed, with Stalin's recommendations, a cult of personality. He everywhere in North Korea, they were told to call him father. Statues and portraits of him were put everywhere. He was presented in this massive sort of public relations campaign as being the source of all knowledge and wisdom, the one that they could look to. They credited him with having gotten rid of the Japanese, who had controlled Korea, although he didn't really have anything to do with it. And so he became this sort of almost mythical figure in North Korea. And you still see, actually this is Kim Il-sung, this is his son, who is Kim Jong-il, took over in 1994. So they passed this on to the son and then to the grandson. The current president in the North is Kim Jong-un, who took over in 2011. And he is the one that currently is involved in saying that he wants to sign a peace treaty to finally end, because technically it never ended, the Korean War never ended. He wants to sign a peace treaty to end the Korean War. The situation in North Korea, contrary to South Korea, has been quite horrendous. They got a lot of help initially from the Soviet Union and some from China. They are the world's last Stalinist regime since the Soviet Union fell apart. Despite all the help, their economy stagnated in the 1970s because of it's been proven over and over again, this is why communism has failed. It's because there is no real initiative that is engendered by a communist system. Then in the 90s, they had a whole series of kind of natural disasters. They had floods, drought, typhoons. Malnutrition is common in North Korea, and famine is common, especially malnutrition is common among children. The Chinese, no less, reported that between 1998 and 2005, they did a study of North Korean children and South Korean children of the same age that they had access to, and that South Korean children were 5 inches taller than North Korean children of the same age, entirely because of nutritional differences. You can't grow as tall if you don't have the nutrition. It's a country that has been terribly hard on its people, political oppression, and it's also true that while they were fairly equal at one point, today South Korea has 50 million people, North Korea has 25 million people, so their population is half. And we're hoping, the latest thing is that Kim Jong-un is having the nuclear testing area disassembled. He has promised to allow reporters and others from the West to come in and witness that they're going to dismantle or destroy wherever they were testing weapons. Some people have said that it might be because they actually had an accident, part of it was destroyed anyway, so this kind of covered that up. But whatever the situation, it is everyone's hopes and prayers that we actually can move forward. There have been 3 times before that the promise was made that they would get rid of the nuclear weapons in the North, that they would try to achieve peace. It hasn't happened, so pray for it. It's something that the world needs. Questions about any of that? I've gone long today, sorry. Yes?
It was said during the Korean War, the U.S. said to the Chinese, if you stayed out of Korea, they would pull out the 7th Fleet from Taiwan.
Okay.
It's straight, was it true or the...
I'm sorry, say that again?
Well, the U.S. said to the Chinese during the Korean War, if you stay out of Korea, we would withdraw the 7th Fleet from Taiwan Strait. But so here say never saw any document.
Yeah, so the question is, the U.S. had told China that if they stayed out of Korea, that we would take the 7th Fleet out of the Taiwan Straits. That's very possible, because the whole point is the American troops had left Korea, and the desire was to sort of let that area settle and to stop having that much influence. But obviously they didn't have a chance for that to happen, because first North Korea invaded, and the U.S. and other UN countries responded, and then China invaded. So what was promised even, I don't know, or what might have happened. But obviously there were other issues. Japan had just recently, been defeated, and so there were issues in terms of maintaining stability in that area. The issue with China of being involved in the political things, that's always been a major question, a major challenge. And I found it interesting that all of the conversation that is coming now from Kim Il-sung, a willingness to negotiate, a willingness in order to gain economic advantages to denuclearize and to begin to enter peace conversations with South Korea and the U.S., all of that started 2 weeks after he made a visit to China. The Chinese still have, because they are the force in this part of the world, or that part of the world, we've left there now, the Chinese still have a great deal of influence. Now, whether they offered to provide the military support if they were ever invaded or not, I don't know. Maybe they offered economic advantages. Maybe they actually said, this can't continue. You have to straighten up. China has the authority probably to say that to North Korea at this point. And so, for whatever reason, it was only a couple of weeks after Kim Il-sung was in China that he began to make gestures toward trying to find a different way of relating to South Korea and the West. Other questions? Yes?
Were there any major contributing factors on why Russia was so successful in their invasion into Manchuria during World War II? It seems like the Japanese army was really strong.
Well, yeah, why were they so successful in Manchuria? I mentioned the fact that in China, Japan still had a significant military force. But we're talking about 2 days after the first nuclear bomb was dropped, the day before the second one. By that time, Okinawa had already been taken, and the Japanese knew that the invasion of the home islands was going to happen. So they were moving a lot of the Kwantung army, the Chinese army, over and into the southern islands of Japan. They were preparing to do what a lot of the military said, we still have an army, an intact army. They were beginning to move them over, and part of it is they were just looking in the other direction. I think was part of it, is that they did not expect that Russia was going to invade. They were still hoping that they'd get word from Stalin that he would help them negotiate a better peace agreement. So I think both of those things. One, they were beginning to reposition their army in order to defend the home islands, and they simply didn't expect it. It was a complete surprise to them. And the Russians came in with such force, as you saw that diagram, that it only took them 2 days to get from the border of Russia and China all the way down into the northern part of Korea. So they weren't messing around. Other questions? Yes?
What was Putin's assessment of the North Korean intentions toward
What is Putin's assessment of the current? I haven't read what Putin's assessment is.
He said they will eat grass before they give up their nuclear weapons.
Yeah, they will eat grass before they give up their nuclear weapons. I mean, my sense of it has been one of hopeful skepticism, meaning I hope it works, but again, there have been 3 other times that these promises have been made and nothing has come of it. And he has not proven to be the most stable person. I mean, he executed one of his uncles with an anti-aircraft gun. Do you know about that? He got it in his head that using an anti-aircraft gun would be a very dramatic symbol of what happens to people he didn't think were sufficiently loyal to him. So shooting a person with an anti-aircraft gun is not, I don't think, something a stable person would do. So, but we don't know. Maybe, maybe he's, I understand that he was, South Korea sent a K-pop musical group up to perform in North Korea. You know K-pop?
Yeah.
You know Psy, the Gangnam Style? That's an example of K-pop. K-pop is a huge musical style in South Korea. Well, they sent a group up to perform in North Korea, and Kim Jong-un came to hear it, and they said he was deeply moved by the K-pop performance. So, maybe music has changed his soul. We don't know. Thank you all very much.